or go to the information tent. The author will take questions from the audience at the end. When asking your question, please line up at the microphone to my right. Ask a question, do not make long statements, let others have a chance to speak, and let the author speak. This afternoon, we're delighted to have Susan Dominus discussing her book, The Family Dynamic, with Alisa Levine. Alisa is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst. She is a training analyst at Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute and works with adults individually and in couples and family therapy in her private practice. She divides her time between Newton and Aquinnah, Mass. And do you want to introduce Susan? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Welcome to Susan Dominus and to all of you. Let me just say a word about today's format, and then I will tell you a little bit more about Susan. We have 50 minutes for the interview, including in the final 10 to 15 minutes, a chance for any of you who might want to ask questions. At that time, if you have a question, please line up at this microphone here to my right, and please ask questions, not speeches. And then Susan's book, as you just heard, will be available for purchase at the sales tent, and Susan will be signing in the book signing tent. Okay. Okay. So, Susan Dominus, who we are delighted to have here with us on the Vineyard at this magnificent book festival, has worked for the New York Times since 2007. First as a Metro columnist, and then as a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. She also teaches journalism at her alma mater, Yale. A few outstanding examples of her long-form journalism work. In 2018, she reported on sexual harassment in the workplace. In 2024, she wrote the New York Times Magazine story, Women Have Been Misled About Menopause, which won a National Magazine Award and really shifted the conversation about menopause. And I can say, yeah, it's been referenced multiple times in my office by women that I consult with. Last year, she wrote the memorable article, Is That Drink Worth It to You? She's written about conjoined twins and an IVF mix-up. Perhaps most relevant, though, to today's discussion, she is the mother of fraternal twins. So. In this, her first book, sitting right here before you, Susan tells the story of 6 families who have high-achieving siblings. In her compelling novellas, which is what each of the 6 actually read like, she tells their stories with respect, care, and compassion. She also weaves in a review of social science research. She tells us about the parents, of course, but she focuses our attention in particular on the underreported influence of siblings on each other. And she explores how that works in these families. So, let's hear from Susan. Okay. So, my first question, and as you've just heard, and many of you have probably read many of Susan's pieces, why this subject for your debut book? Here you go.
Oh, thank you. I forgot about the microphone.
Yeah.
Forgot about the microphone. Whatever my assignment, and it can be about anything. It can take place in Afghanistan. It can be about social science. It can be about alcohol. Almost, I often find myself realizing that I'm writing about family because it's such a basic unit of every story that we tell ourselves, and it also lends itself so well to storytelling. But I think that I myself, as a small kid, had an unusual fascination with other friends' families. My parents used to travel a lot. Actually, this is kind of funny. In my book, I say that when they traveled for work, they would leave us with family friends, and they corrected me and said, we were traveling for vacation. Which tells you a little bit about my own parents, but who are wonderful. But because I spent as many as 2 weeks at a time in other people's homes, I became very fascinated by the different family cultures. So our family's best friends I would stay with them, and while we were at dinner, the father would ask his sons very elaborate math problems. One plane is leaving Atlanta at this time, and it's meeting another going this many hours an hour. And I was so interested in that and thought it was so fun to watch them do this until the father asked me one day, and I burst into tears. I was definitely ready to go home by the end, but I became kind of a familyologist. I realized, there's a lot of different ways to do this family thing. And I also noticed that some of it was very much about enrichment and, carried with it some kind of expectations. And because I myself, frankly, was a weirdly ambitious little kid, I was interested in families like the Wassersteins, whose various kids went to my summer camp. Wendy Wasserstein, the playwright, and Bruce Wasserstein, the financier. There was another sister whom we all thought had invented MTV, which I don't think was true, but that's what we thought. And I was curious, how did those siblings become that way? What gave them the confidence? What made them think they could be trailblazers and innovators? So this was just a personal fascination of mine.
Thank you. So how did you come to focus on the influence of the siblings in these families? Is that how you started, or did it develop?
No. Yeah. In fact, one review implied that, in an effort to say something new, I started looking at siblings. But actually, what happened is I thought I was writing a parenting book, and I kept asking parents about what they did and how they framed it and what were the things they said and what were the rituals. What I really heard over and over again was that the young people from these very high-achieving families, they often had tremendous respect for their parents, and they really did want to do right by their parents and either honor their sacrifice or live up to their own storied, histories. But when it really got down to the nitty-gritty of how they got where they were, what were the mechanisms that allowed them to succeed, it was always about their siblings. It was about an older brother who, basically... So Marilyn Hollifield is somebody I write about in the book. She's a civil rights activist who was among other things, she desegregated a high school in Tallahassee, one of 3 students. But she also was one of the first Black women to attend Harvard Law School and become a partner at a major law firm. She did very many fascinating things. And her brother, who'd gone to Harvard Law School, he kind of badgered her until she agreed to go. He thought it would be great for her and great for the world. I don't think her parents, who were extremely impressive people in their own right, at that moment in time would have necessarily had the vision to think, here's what you should do as a Black woman in 1968, go to Harvard Law School. But Bishop had been there and could envision it for her. He could see the future in a way that maybe their parents couldn't. And that was a theme that came up. I think the other thing I'll say is that I tell the story of my own brother who, I think this is maybe why at some level I was interested when I was in high school. My brother, who's 6 years older, came home from college and said, I think you should join the paper. I think you'd like it. And I said, well, we don't have a high school newspaper. It's defunct. It was a public school in Harrison, New York. And my brother stood in the doorway of my room, basically badgering me. He lecturing me about the decline of democracy and student apathy, until I agreed to do it. And what's interesting about siblings, maybe you know Lisa D'Amour's work, but Lisa calls parental advice to adolescents the kiss of death advice, because a lot of young people, it's developmental. You don't want to really get advice from your parents, and yet I think siblings will take advice from other siblings in adolescence, in young adulthood. So if you have a sibling who's looking out for you at all, that can be extremely instrumental, and yet so little psychology ever touches on those relationships.
Exactly, and that's what you do so beautifully in this book. It opens a whole new realm
Thank you,
of the
Alisa.
influence of siblings. So speaking of these families and the sibling relationships, can you talk a little bit about how you selected the 6 fascinating families in this book, and also a little bit about the process of coming to know them,
Yeah,
sort
I'd
of
be happy
embedding
to.
yourself within their worlds, and then how that worked for you?
I will say that for one thing, I really only wanted to write about families whom I admired and enjoyed. I think I figured if I'm going to spend this much time with these families, I want to admire them. And I also thought it was obviously very important not to write about siblings who were on a conveyor belt of privilege. I mean, it's not that unusual for a family who comes from affluence to send their kids to the best schools, and lo and behold, they have all sorts of opportunities. I was interested in mechanisms of how children in disadvantaged families were able to elevate their circumstances and also have the bravery and vision to dream big and be bold, and without suggesting that every family, if only they had those kinds of, optimistic messages. Obviously there are structural forces that keep families from succeeding, and I talk a lot about that in the book too. But I was curious about kids who really had overcome in order to do great things. So some of it was, whose stories did I admire, whose stories were different from each other's, and to some degree, who would tell me their stories. I mean, one of the reasons I think a lot of these families are very positive is because the young people who spoke to me, or the older people at this point, a lot of them wanted to honor their parents. That's the only reason they agreed to do it. But people who had really messy, complicated stories, those were people who were more likely to shy away, honestly. And there was one family I remember I was getting kind of deep in, and then they got very suspicious because there was some dark secret in their father's life, that they were worried I was going to touch on. And I wanted the book to feel good for me as a reporting experience, and for the families as well. So there were a lot of factors that went into it.
Yeah. So this was not a how-to parent book, which for some of us is disappointment, for some of us it's a relief, but is there something or a set of takeaways from these 6 distinct families with very different situations that you can tell us about?
I mean, I can just tell you the themes that I noticed. Unfortunately, they're not necessarily themes that anyone can suddenly decide to adopt, but many of the parents in these books, they may not have been famous the way that their children ended up, or done things that were historic necessarily, but many of them were tremendous overcomers. I mean, in a way, every immigrant who comes to this country not speaking the language and managing to get by, I have so much really being deep inside the family of, let's say, the Chens, who was a Chinese immigrant family that moved. They ran to escape the one-child policy in China. The mom was pregnant with her third child, had a third child rather, and they moved to Appalachia and opened a Chinese restaurant, and didn't speak a word of English. And I mean, just really hearing all the details of that. So they were tremendous. Or they were people who. Lauren Groff is this novelist. Many of you probably know her work. Her sister's an Olympic athlete. Her brother is a self-made serial entrepreneur who's done very well in the healthcare, very, very well in the healthcare field. And their father had who became a doctor, actually lived in an orphanage for many years of his life. So, and their mother had come from a household whose father was abusive and alcoholic. So, and they had built this beautiful life and given their children all kinds of opportunity. But these kids saw that their parents had overcome. And I don't think you become an overcomer unless you are, and this was really fascinating to me because it's not my family culture, just tremendous optimism, honestly. I mean, just tremendous kind of, and I think some of it for these families was faith. The Murguias used to say, Mary Murguia, whose children were all jurists and philanthropists who'd come from real financial insecurity. She would say, with God's help, all things are possible. And Marilyn Hollifield told me that the unspoken motto in their household was all things possible. I mean, it was that kind of thing came up over and over again. And I don't know if you can fake that if it's not native to you or inherent in how you feel. I think kids have incredible BS detectors, especially when it comes to their parents. But I mean, all I can say is that was a common theme. And then there was one other concept that my friend Nell Casey brought me this language. She called it the finishing child. And the finishing child is the child who picks up where a parent had to leave off. And it's not necessarily because the parent forced them or encouraged them. I think it's something more subconscious and deeper than that, but it's the parent who wanted to be a brilliant director, as Diane Paulus's father did, but either didn't have. Diane Paulus, the director of Jagged Little Pill and Real Innovator, she's in the book, but just didn't either have the talent or the drive, or the timing wasn't right. So these are some of the. Tony Kushner, his mother was a tremendous musician who had to give up her place in the orchestra because Tony's older sister was. She was thought to have problems. It turned out she was deaf, and so she gave up her career. But was very. Tony talks about it in interviews. She was very bitter about having had to give up her career and her art. And I think it sort of gets into these kids, and they take over and keep going.
One of the quotes that you refer to about the overcomers and the impact on the kids and the siblings is, which I loved, is if you want your kids to be a better human, the way to do it is to be a better human. And that says everything that one can say about role modeling as parents. And in each of these families, there was some version of that, whether it was through overcoming hardship or a career choice, but there was some version of that had a huge impact on the siblings.
Yeah, or just tremendous industry. I mean, and so the Chen's parents, worked 6 or 7 days a week, and their mother would say, in China, because we were violating the one-child policy, you really never had a chance at succeeding. Here, all you got to do is work hard. Now, we know it's more complicated than that, but that was the message that they got. All you have to do is work hard, and you will succeed. And they did see their parents working hard at that restaurant every day of the week. But as we've talked about a little bit before in the green room, I also think that modeling actually, to some degree, is slightly overrated as a phenomenon, because we've never been able to control in these research studies for genetics. And, everything is a little bit hereditary. It's not that there's like a gene for conscientiousness or a gene for hardworking, but some of that is, inborn. Like, parents of twins know how much is inborn in fraternal twins because they're so different from the moment they are playing with puzzles. So, I do think it's possible that people who are tremendously industrious sometimes also have kids who are inclined that way. Not always, but there's a big role of the genetic dice. But anyway, I think it's important to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think you do a beautiful job in this book. The chapters are interspersed, the social science review with the narrative of these different families. And you do a wonderful job both reviewing more of the recent literature and also critiquing where it leaves off and what needs to still be learned. And issues like, sort of themes like genetics, temperament, luck, fate. Like you talk about all of these as well as having an impact that may not be measurable, but you clearly can see in these different situations.
Yeah, I mean, I told the story yesterday, so forgive me those of you who heard me speak, but one of the families I write about are the Murguias, and two of them were twins, identical twins. In fact, they were such identical twins that the doctor thought there was one child when he put up the stethoscope because their hearts were beating in unison. I mean, it's really incredible. And even after I had spent a lot of time with them, I sometimes was not sure who I was talking to. But so Mary Murguia is the chief judge of the Ninth Circuit, and her sister, Janet Murguia, is the head of Unidos US, which is the biggest civil rights organization in the country. And when they were in
Latina civil rights. Right?
What did I say?
Yeah. Just
Latino civil rights. It used to be called La Raza. So when they were 17, they were both, of course, star students and leaders, and they were both in line to be sent to Girls State, which is this tremendous leadership organization. It's like Boys State. People go from there into a lot of famous people like Bill Clinton, and even Brad Pitt did Boys State, and Girls State similarly. It's a great venue for natural leaders. Anyway, she looked at them and she thought, I don't really think that I can send identical twins to Girls State. But you're both so qualified, so I'm just going to flip a coin. And so she flipped a coin, and Janet Murguia not only went to Girls State, but she did so well there that she went to Girls Nation. She did so well at Girls Nation that she ended up, after graduating from law school, returning to D.C. She became a very close aide to Clinton. She was flying around the world, meeting with Latin American heads of state. This is all happening by the time she's 30. Her twin Mary was still living at home in Kansas City at age 30, and they were equally talented, equally qualified. Now, Mary McGee was making her way in local politics, as a local district attorney, and, obviously ended up doing very well and ended up the chief judge of the Ninth Circuit. But when you think about how different their lives were, it really was the flip of a coin. And it's hard to imagine that Mary would not have succeeded just as Janet did at Girls State, at Girls Nation. So I think really successful people who are honest and humble will acknowledge the role of luck in their lives. There is often a turning point.
So moving back to something you mentioned before that I find especially interesting, I would say developmental psychology and a lot of the family and psychoanalytic literature has predominantly emphasized like the underbelly of sibling relationships, rivalries, competitions, envy, at times even estrangement among siblings. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what you learned. I love your framing of both and you talk about it in a really lovely way, and that there can be competition and collaboration, that one doesn't necessarily eliminate the other. But I wonder if there's some stories where you actually heard more of this underside of sibling relationships, or again, if the families who agreed to be part of this experience were less likely to talk about those aspects.
I think that, again, this is something I spoke about yesterday, but I think that we do know that, one of the things that does happen with sibling relationships is differentiation. And so in the book, Sarah True talks a lot about, Sarah True is this Olympic athlete turned world-class Ironman champion, and who's now getting her PhD in psychology, but will still tell you that she was sort of the dumb one of the family, which of course can't possibly be true. But she will say that because her brother and sister were so committed were such stars academically, she just felt like rather than try to compete, she was going to throw her talent into something else. And for her, that was sports. And there is a lot of research that suggests that younger siblings are overrepresented in sports. And why do we think that's true? Because one thing that does and has been proven over and over again in research is like a lot of birth order research turns out not to be true. Whatever stories you hold in your head about birth order are probably not true. But that the oldest child has an IQ advantage, that does hold up over and over again. And there's all kinds of reasons why that might be. But there's this idea that the oldest child has this academic edge, which is reinforced by parenting to some degree. Why do they have the academic edge? Because they're the only child in their family who was ever an only child and had the benefit of all of that enrichment and all of that attention in their early years. Hence, then the younger kids choose something else. They choose sports. So I don't, it's not. This is on average for all of the. I'm a third child, so I'm the first to say that's the case. But yeah.
So, given all that you learned about parenting from these 6 families and sibling relationships, a question that I'm sure you've been asked and have thought about is: has the book and writing the book and the process of knowing these families so well influenced your own parenting?
So I think that for me, very early on my reporting, I ran up against a finding that behavioral geneticists stand by, which is that the effects of parenting are much, much smaller than we think. And it's not that genes are all determinative. It's just when we talk about nature and nurture, parenting is such a small part of the nurture picture. Like, nurture is parenting, but it's also everything else. It's the video games your kids play. It's the teacher they have in 2nd grade. It's who is their best friend. Was their bedroom sunny? Did they break their knee, when they were about to go out for the game? It's the environment is vast, and the parenting role is important, and it's part of our stories, but it does not have the actual effect on outcomes and personality traits and income, let's say, or career success that parents imagine that it does, unless you're talking about real outliers, and there are many outliers in my book. But, I think then you get into the question of what does it cost to be the outlier parent who can make your child succeed. So for me, it was very liberating. I think that I, of course, always strive to be the best parent I could be for my fraternal twins, but no one has less faith in the power of parenting than parents of fraternal twins. Because, in our case, we read them the same stories every night. We fed them the same food. We had the same motivation charts on the fridge. And my kids are so diametrically opposite. And of course, I like to think that the things they have in common that are wonderful are a reflection of our parenting. But it's just, you see, in the grand scheme of things, socioeconomically, they both went to college. They both, well, that's about it. I would say that's their overlap. They're both going to college. And that's actually one of the most determinative things that does affect someone's outcomes. Did you go to college or not? Historically, whether that's true going forward, I don't know. But so that's huge. That's the most important parenting thing a parent can probably do within the realm of, non-abusive behavior, let's say. So I found it very liberating. And I think that a lot of parents get into trouble when they try to make their kid be something or do something, and they feel it's their responsibility and that the world is judging them if they have not succeeded in that way. And I think it's healthy for everybody to let go of that, in part because the more you try to make your child succeed, the more you run the risk. We do know that when parents get over-involved, they undermine kids' intrinsic motivation. So you're making yourself miserable, you're making your kids miserable, and you're not actually achieving whatever it was you sent out to achieve.
Right. You also make a great point. Yes. Parents. Yeah. You make a great point about expectations as well.
Yeah. Well, they're very nuanced. We know that. And after I did this book, a woman said to me, was interviewing me, and she said, I just don't understand it. I set, the same expectations for both my children, and my daughter met them, and my son has not, And it was like, do I have to explain to her that, not all kids come into the world equally prepared to rock it in the very conventional and somewhat constrictive and unimaginative thing we call our school system? It's like, it's you can't just set these expectations and then feel you're a failure if you haven't, reinforced them enough or something. We know that when parents set expectations too high, we see increases in anxiety and unhappiness. And so it's sure, you want to encourage your kids to be their best selves without arbitrarily picking a place you would like them to be.
Right, and also the bidirectional piece of this, which is that children elicit a particular kind of parenting from the very same parent. Different children elicit different parenting.
I'm so glad you said that because, again, I think that, parents feel so guilty if they find themselves, for example, more short with one of their children. But, the truth is that some kids really are harder to parent. And, you have to sort of control for that as a parent because let's say your kid does have ADHD. Mm-hmm. If you are reacting impulsively yourself to your child's ADHD, you're certainly not going to help that child developmentally. But at the same time, I think parents do deserve a break in that we have to recognize that parents, just as you said, children elicit a certain kind of parenting. So this is why a lot of people talk about authoritarian parenting being having bad outcomes and authoritative parenting having good outcomes. But a woman named Julia Harris wrote a book called The Nurture Assumption. And she, said, well, when do parents become authoritarian? When they have very challenging children. Those are the parents who are setting all kinds of rules. And, and then it's just hard to tell where the chicken and the egg is. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay. Yeah. Judith Harris, The Nurture Assumption.
Yeah, the bidirectional process that you're describing.
It's the bidirectional process.
So you mentioned before ADHD or depression. One of the things you also talk about in the book that I think is really an important kind of message to all of us is, and I think the Groff family in particular have talked about this, two of the sisters, sometimes the effect of having to be the very best, to be an Olympic athlete, to be a novelist that's winning prizes. And they've both, two of the sisters in that case, I think maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that, have talked about some of the possible sequela of such success.
Yeah, one of the things I admire most about Sarah True is, forget that she's an Olympic athlete, which of course is interesting and admirable in its own right. But Sarah was actually one of the very first athletes, like long before, Naomi Osaka was talking about it, or meant to talk openly about the mental health struggles of elite athletes. And she talked about her own depression in the 2012 Olympics, I believe it was. She had a shot at winning the bronze and instead really flamed out and was actually unable to finish the race. She had trained for it her whole life. She had given up so much to do it. Actually, it was in 2016, I believe. Anyway, she talked openly in the press about how that she was suicidal, following that crushing disappointment. And I think there's a real sense of loss of purpose when you've spent your entire life building towards this one goal. Now, obviously, depression, and Lauren Groff talks a lot about her own anxiety and depression as well. A lot of unsuccessful people are anxious and depressive, but I think it's important to it just really brought home that success does not protect you from that. And there's a lot of research that finds that when people reach some pinnacle of success that they've been going for their whole lives, they are especially vulnerable to depression after that. So there are, obviously achievement can be very motivating and it can be energizing, but it can be fraught. And for some of these families, it clearly was. Yeah.
So I'd like to open the conversation to audience members. If anyone's interested in asking a question, please come up to this mic. And again, questions, not speeches. Thank you.
So I have a question after saying that parenting isn't that impactful. I am curious if you saw in these families where the siblings helped, were there things parents did that encouraged that or helped siblings work well together? Because they do create new niches for each other, right? And they compete.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you saw anything there.
It's a great question. And I actually do know of families, and I grew up with one of these families where the parents really encouraged each of the kids, for example, to do a different sport. Or, the Bryant twins are the world's most winning doubles team in history. And their parents actually wouldn't allow them, when they were growing up in tennis tournaments, to compete against each other. Because the father was afraid that if one of them lost to his brother, he'd think, my God, I can't even beat my brother. How am I going to beat the rest of the world? Which is what and he took it really far. So, for example, when one of the kids just playing around in the backyard took the ball and hit it over some tree that was really high, he spent the entire day with a twin to make sure that he could hit it over the tree as well, which I think sends a different message maybe, which is, you sort of want your kids to be okay, most of us, with the recognition that the world, you're not always going to be equal in everything. But he was hell-bent on making a unit out of them, and it did lead to great things for those kids, certainly. Anyway. Yes, Jason.
Hi, Susan. Very interesting, but you talked about two different things, it seemed to me. You seem to contrast or make a false dichotomy between anxiety, neuroses, and unhappiness and high achievement. Some of us parents think they go together. We instill a good amount of anxiety and neuroses in our kids and unhappiness, and then they'll be high achievers.
Would you like to share with us your techniques for doing that, Jason?
No, they're secret.
You'll have to write your own book about how to achieve that. Yeah. I don't think I did create that false dichotomy, though. I think it's recognizably part and parcel. Yeah.
Hello. I said hello earlier and told you I'm here with two of my siblings. I don't know if they choose to identify. I'm here with two of my three older siblings, so I don't know if they choose to self-identify. But and I was the girl after three boys. So one of the things I wondered is what was the role of gender. My father was an old-fashioned, guy who used to say, when I showed ambition, he'd say, "Well, hopefully you're going to get married." And that'll be that. But I did grow up feeling like there was nothing I couldn't do. My mother probably contributed to that. So I'm just curious about that.
It's funny, not to be too personal, but my mother always, my sister and I both worked our whole lives, and until my sister actually pre-tired, she was able to retire. But my mother always said to us, you need to have a career so you can be independent and you can walk away if you want from an unhappy marriage or. But anyway, so the Wojcicki's are one of the families I write about. Anne Wojcicki, who died very young and tragically last year, was the CEO of YouTube. And her sister, Anne Wojcicki, founded 23andMe, which, by the way, talk about the ups and downs of success. They're in bankruptcy now. But most of us would agree that it was a very influential and important business for a long time and kind of changed the world in subtle ways. Their third sister is an epidemiologist and a professor. And there is some research that suggests that when girls grow up with, the way the study was contrived, it only looked at sisters with younger brothers, but basically having a brother in the family was linked with girls pursuing more gender-typical careers. And so you see a lot of these families of three sisters in which all of them are in, let's say, STEM. It's not surprising. The researcher's name was Anne Bruneau, and she was an economist. And I said to her, "Do you have a brother?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Oh, but you obviously went into not a conventionally female career." And she said, "Yes, but if I had a sister, maybe I'd be a physicist." And of course, all these things are just averages. But that research was quite good, and I had a very large sample and was really rigorous. And so, a few other things I'll say about gender is I do think that. The sibling pairs that fight the most and are the least close are brother pairs, and sister pairs are the closest. And from my own personal observation, I think having an older sister and a younger brother situation, it makes for very nice men. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anything that we haven't covered that you would want to be sure our audience take with them?
No, I don't know. I just think these families are outliers and their stories are rich and complex, and I hope they're very readable and novelistic. I think every person who reads the book ends up taking away something a little bit different from it. So that's been interesting to hear from people, and I'd always love to hear from my readers. So, Andrea? Yeah.
Here. Right over there. Thanks.
So I'm a huge admirer of your work, Sue, and I've watched your career just surprise us again and again with these revelatory stories for decades.
Too kind. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about just something that goes more to just the work of the journalist in this project of getting people to talk about something so intimate? How did you draw them out? You mentioned one stumble. Maybe if you could just kind of talk us through a little bit your process in getting them to show themselves.
I think if the families knew that I'd be calling them 8 years later, they would not have said yes at the outset. I think very few people have someone sit across from them who has all the time in the world and is genuinely curious and wants to hear everything. And so to some degree, the work of the journalist is not that hard if you are patient and empathetic. And often it is, Andrea, I'm sure you know this, it can be very therapeutic for the people you're talking to. Marilyn Hollifield went through hell when she desegregated a high school in Tallahassee. And people had written books about the civil rights movement and of Tallahassee in particular, and she had declined to give interviews about her experience. And I know that she told me things that happened to her that she had never spoken aloud of to anyone. And now the world it's been 8 years, it was a very consequential 8 years for race in America, but she does talk about it more now. And I think she had locked it away. It was so painful. She talks about being, coming to school and getting off the bus and kids throwing eggs at her. She was, a beautiful, immaculately dressed young woman. And there was nobody even black, there wasn't even a black, there's not one black employee of the school to comfort her or be there for her. She started telling that story more often. She ended up contributing to a memoir about the activist movement at Swarthmore. And I think if you are just, you know this, if you're patient, if you keep coming back, if you make people comfortable with especially for something like this, I didn't feel that I had to extract everything. There were limits. If they had limits, that was okay. But it was really a privilege to hear these families' stories. And I think they felt, because they knew they had done extraordinary things or their parents were extraordinary, some of them, they were sort of eager to talk about it. And then people generally can't help but tell the truth eventually. Don't you find? They can't, it's a very human instinct. And I like to think I made them feel safe and they trusted me. And I really, as I said, I didn't write about families I didn't admire. And it was one of the great reporting privileges of my life to hear these stories and get to know these families whom I really came to love.
Yeah. Well, and Susan, I think the reason they were open with you to the extent that they were, which was you took deep dives with them, is because you did create a sense of safety. And there's, as I said at the beginning, and I so recommend this book because the care, respect, and compassion with which Susan writes about these families is really remarkable. And again, I think the overlap between a psychotherapy world and what you were saying about a journalist open and wanting to hear everything with no judgment, just curiosity, is a really powerful parallel, basically.
I'll say one last thing and then we can end. One of the speakers on our panel yesterday mentioned that in interviewing her father, it became a way to heal their relationship. And if anybody out there has a relationship that is still tormenting them with a parent, or, I think it's a great way, every parent of a child lived through a different generation has a story to tell, and I do think it's a beautiful way to get closer to a parent and maybe even without too much effort work some things through. So
thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Alisa. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. Thank you, Susan. Please go buy this book. You will really enjoy it and learn a lot.